So I just realised that however big you make this, I won't be able to see it on the screen, so I just need to put on my glasses. So in terms of the Social Metrics Commission, about the Commission, we are a wholly independent charity, so we deliberately set up to be completely independent, and we actually host all of our meetings here, which is why we're doing the launch here. And part of that, again, is to express the independence of the charity. Commissioners, advisors, and others are involved on a personal basis. So even though you see a number of the organisations that people represent, we have asked people that when they're in the room, not to be just singing their organisation's line. It's their brain, their history, and their experience that we want them in the room for. So rather than representing the organisations they're employed by. So in the centre there you have the commissioners who are involved with it. So myself, Kerry Oppenheim from the Early Intervention Foundation, Christine from the Big Society Capital, David Halpin from the Behavioural Insights team, David Hutchison from Social Finance, and I think one of his colleagues is here today. Obviously, David Laws, Devon Galani from Policy and Practice, Helen, who's at the back from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Helen keeps us completely on our toes, I would like to point out. If there's something we haven't thought of, she will think of it, which is great. Hitan Shah from the Royal Statistical Society, Leon Feinstein from the Office of the Children's Commissioner, Nick Harrison from Oliver Wyman, Oliver Hilbury from Making Every Adult Matter, Paul Gregg from the University of Bath, Robert Joyce from the Institute for Physical Studies, who bears with me when I constantly say that I'm trying to create something that is similar to rival the IFS. He's very gracious to me. Sian Hansen, Stephen Bryan from the Department for Work and, ex-Department for Work and Pension, and Stephen Shakespeare from YouGov. And just in terms of the structure of the Commission, we meet as a Commission on a six-weekly basis. We have a steering committee that meets about, well, at the moment we're meeting weekly, but normally fortnightly. We have a secretariat who's Matt Oakley from WPI Economics, a technical team from Oliver Wyman. We're hugely grateful to Oliver Wyman. They've done this pro bono for us and put superb analysts onto that team. Our methodological advisors are from OFI, the Oxford Poverty and Human Initiative, and they are amazing and have huge experience. They've helped 50 or 60 countries around the world develop poverty metrics. Then we have a group of policy advisors, Baroness Hollis, who is here today. Thank you so much for joining us. Fraser Nelson, John Pullinger from the, our national statistician, and then an expert group of academics and an advisory group which feeds in. So that is the structure of the Commission. But our ultimate goal is to develop new poverty metrics for the UK. We want these metrics to both have long-term political support and effectively identify those who are in poverty. By doing so, we hope that government and others will be better able to develop interventions that reduce the number of people experiencing poverty and improve outcomes for those people who do experience it. So the whole way along, our objective is, will this actually enable governments to make the right interventions with disadvantaged people? We think these metrics should have technical credibility. It must be possible and practical to measure regularly. Political feasibility, it must have support from a wide range of political views, and policy feasibility. Policymakers must be able to influence the measures by taking action that improves social outcomes both now and in the future. And that's going back to my point of, if governments take action that's good for people and it moves your indicators in the wrong direction, that's not great. So, work to date. We started by asking ourselves the question, why do we need measures? What is the history of poverty measurement? What went wrong that the previous government decided to abolish the metrics that it had? Were there issues with the old measures? What were they? What lessons can be learnt from previous experiences? What are the characteristics of a good measure? What criteria should new poverty measures meet? Are there additional considerations that the Commission should include? What does the Commission mean by poverty? What should our working definition be? Are there particular factors that should be included or excluded? This is a really interesting question because there's a real difference between what academics view as the definition of poverty and what practitioners view as the definition of poverty, and then perhaps even what the lived experience of poverty is for people. So that's something we've really wrestled with. What are the Commission's next steps? How should we distinguish between different factors such as risk of poverty and poverty now? Obviously, if government interventions can stop people from becoming poor in the first place, hugely beneficial. And what are the next areas of exploration for the Commission? So, the need for new measures. We believe that government, though, is not open to simply attempting to reinstate the previous poverty measures. So if the conclusion of our Commission was just to go back and say, do you know what, actually 60% median income was right, there isn't any hope, in our view, that we would get that adopted. It would also miss a vital opportunity to improve the approach of the previous measures. So some of the characteristics that I've described would not be addressed through just doing that. Our goal is to produce measures that will be better than previous ones, and in developing these new metrics, the Commission is clear that proposals must robustly answer criticisms of the previous measures. If we're going to move forward, we need to ensure that we address those criticisms. So, what makes a good measure? Obviously, this slide could have about 15 points on it. We've just selected 5 or 6 of the ones that we felt would be particularly pertinent to today. Experience of the debate over the last decade indicates that beyond methodological rigour, there are several criteria that new metrics must meet. We want a measure or a set of measures to have a number of characteristics. It needs to be communicable. The new poverty metrics need to have a clear purpose and be communicable to a wide range of stakeholders, including the media. I need to be able to ring Allegra up and I need to say to her, this policy impacts poverty in this way, and I can't have a half-an-hour discussion with her trying to explain what these metrics are and how they behave. If that's what we produce, we will have failed and you will be very bored.
And I will have trouble with my bosses.
And you'll have trouble with your bosses. So it needs to be easily communicable. It needs credibility. The methodology used to create the metrics needs to be robust, transparent, and replicable, built from data that government and a wide range of stakeholders would recognise as credible and that they would use. So some of our discussions have been, oh, there's this survey data, or there's this survey data, or there's this admin data. You know, could we somehow bring that in? But if government wouldn't actually use it, and they don't view it as robust or credible enough, there's no point in us justifying a particular hobby horse of ours by using it. It needs to be something that they would recognise. It needs to be responsive. It must be possible to rapidly update the new metrics based on new data and evidence, and also to see where we have come from. So we need to be able to backcast it and forecast it, and we need to be able to calculate it quickly for accountability purposes. Policy relevance. National and local policymakers should have options available to them that they can use to move the metric. So we might think of something that we really think is part of poverty. If there's genuinely nothing that government can do about it, and yet they are going to be lambasted and held accountable for it, that isn't going to be an effective metric. And accountability. It must be possible to use the new metrics to hold local and national government and others to account over the policy directions. So, on what do we mean by poverty? We asked commissioners to describe poverty, and these are some of their responses. Every commissioner came up with things that they wanted to, that we could have literally like 15, 20 different definitions. We took those that most clearly summarised the whole of what people were saying to us. So lacking the material resources to be able to live a basically comfortable life. Secondarily, perhaps lacking the resources, material and other, to be able to participate in society in a basically adequate way. One of the things that was important about these, I don't need to read them all out because they are there for you to see, but each of the metrics, the definitions of poverty that people came up with, there were kind of three aspects to it. One was a resource issue, a material kind of resource issue. The second was a kind of social participation issue. It has something about being able to take part in the world in which you're placed. And the third was I'm empowered to do something. There's an empowering factor in here as well. And those or not. And those were three very interesting aspects of people's definitions as we went through them. And we put them into a Wordle for you. And this is interesting because I think what it shows is the weight of what commissioners were saying. And again, it kind of divides down into a resources and an income and a kind of material element, and then a society and a kind of social element as well. So that was just quite an interesting kind of us trying to grapple with what is poverty. So we then started trying to develop an emerging conceptual framework. And I'll just go through this really quickly. Our overall objective is to create measures that influence policy and improve outcomes. This suggests that our measures should be used to understand two things. The first is the groups we want to identify. And here we think of two distinct groups, those at risk of poverty. We want to know who is at risk of entering poverty in the future so we can try to reduce the likelihood of it happening. And then those in poverty, we want to know who is experiencing poverty now so we can target interventions to help them now. But secondly, how we or government might segment these groups. And there are two margins here. One is depth of poverty, for example, destitution versus just within the threshold. And then length of poverty, temporary versus entrenched versus moving in and out. And then this links back to the drivers of poverty. So are the drivers of poverty, the pathways to poverty, the same things as those that make you stuck and that keep you there over a long period of time? Is there work that we can do in that space? We can consider measuring these four aspects in the conceptual framework on the next slide. So there are three separate potential areas for us to explore. So we can examine and measure the extent to which people are at risk of future poverty and entrenchment of poverty alongside a measure of current status. So this informs three distinct areas of exploration, looking at risk, how many people are at risk of future poverty, outcomes, poverty now, how many people are in poverty now, and then risks and outcomes, how many people in poverty are in persistent poverty or at risk of entrenchment. And we want to identify the factors that lead to those different outcomes. So just so that you've got a sense of where we're going as a commission, our next stage is to start creating trial measures, building trial measures of poverty drivers, poverty now, and poverty entrenchment risk, on which indicators to include, how to include them, and how to bring them together. Structuring the measure, whether the measure should be based on households, individuals, or benefit unit. Whether it is appropriate to compare like for like or against the whole population. How to treat the differences between adults, pensioners, and children. And what's really interesting about the historic poverty debate is that it was focused on children and pensioners, left a lot of single people out in the middle. And then how to treat extra costs like disability, children, and in-kind incomes, free school meals, childcare, and education. And then exploring the cut-offs and weights. Once a set of trial measures has been created, we will need to understand the consequences of setting cut-offs and weights at different levels. Woo! And if you want any answers to any questions, Matt is your man. So that was just the process that we've been going through as a commission, just a whistle-stop tour of trying to sum up the last 6 months and then set the agenda for going forward over the next year.
Great. Well,